Lionel Johnson's fatal flaw: paranoid secrecy. Lionel Johnson's greatest weakness was his pathological inability to trust others with information. Growing up hunting great beasts on Caliban taught him that survival depended on keeping advantages hidden, but he applied this mentality to his own allies. Lion maintained layers of secrets within the Dark Angels, creating circles of knowledge that excluded even his most trusted warriors. He refused to explain his strategies and kept crucial intelligence from his officers. This paranoid secrecy created deep resentment within the Dark Angels' ranks. Luther, his second-in-command and childhood mentor, felt increasingly excluded and manipulated. When Luther questioned Lion's decisions, Lion responded with more secrecy rather than explanation. This cycle of distrust eventually split the Legion during the Horus Heresy, with Luther leading a faction in open rebellion on Caliban. This flaw of paranoid secrecy transformed Lion's greatest strength, his strategic mind, into the weapon that destroyed his own Legion from within. Fulgrim's fatal flaw: obsession with perfection. Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection became an addiction that consumed his judgment and morality. On Chemos, perfection meant survival in a toxic industrial environment, but Fulgrim transformed this necessity into an obsessive lifestyle. He couldn't accept anything less than flawless execution in combat, art, strategy, or personal achievement. This drive initially made the Emperor's children supremely effective, but it created an insatiable hunger for ever greater experiences. Slaanesh exploited this obsession by offering Fulgrim sensations and achievements beyond mortal limits. When conventional perfection no longer satisfied him, Fulgrim began seeking perfection through excess and corruption. His need to experience perfect combat led him to fight his brother Ferrus Manus at the Dropsite Massacre, achieving the perfect kill by beheading his closest friend. This flaw of obsessive perfectionism made Fulgrim the perfect target for chaos corruption, as his need for flawless experiences could never truly be satisfied. Perturabo's fatal flaw: bitter resentment. Perturabo's inability to find satisfaction in duty without recognition poisoned his loyalty over decades. Despite his unmatched genius in siege warfare, he consistently received assignments that were strategically crucial but offered no glory. While other Primarchs conquered worlds and earned fame, Perturabo built defenses and handled the thankless work of securing imperial territory. This pattern of underappreciation fed Perturabo's natural bitterness until it overwhelmed his sense of duty. He began viewing every assignment as evidence that the Emperor undervalued him. His resentment made him vulnerable to Horus's manipulation during the heresy, as the War Master offered him recognition that the Emperor had never provided. This flaw of bitter resentment transformed Perturabo from the Imperium's greatest siege master into one of its most dangerous enemies, proving that unacknowledged service breeds betrayal. Jaghatai Khan's fatal flaw: reckless independence. Jaghatai Khan's need for absolute freedom made him unreliable when the Imperium needed stability. His tribal upbringing on Chogoris taught him that true strength came from independence and mobility, but these values became problematic during times of crisis. Jaghatai consistently chose personal freedom over institutional responsibility, refusing to be constrained by regulations or strategic necessities. When Dark Eldar raiders threatened Imperial territory after the Horus Heresy, Jaghatai chose to pursue them into the Webway rather than remaining to help rebuild the shattered Imperium. His decision to chase enemies into unknown territory abandoned his legion and deprived humanity of his tactical expertise during its most vulnerable period. This flaw of reckless independence meant that when the Imperium most needed its defenders to stay and rebuild, Jaghatai chose the freedom of the hunt over the duty of leadership. Leman Russ's fatal flaw: uncontrolled fury. Leman Russ's wolfish rage made him a devastating warrior, but a poor decision-maker in complex situations. His upbringing among the wolves of Fenris taught him that overwhelming violence could solve most problems, but this approach proved catastrophically inadequate when dealing with nuanced challenges. Russ's fury made him react emotionally rather than tactically. The burning of Prospero exemplifies this flaw perfectly. When Horus manipulated the Emperor's orders, Russ's rage at Magnus's perceived betrayal overwhelmed his judgment, leading him to devastate Prospero and push Magnus into chaos. His inability to control his fury in critical moments made him a weapon that could be misdirected by cleverer enemies. This flaw of uncontrolled fury transformed the Emperor's executioner into an unwitting servant of the very forces he was meant to destroy. Rogel Dorn's fatal flaw: inflexible stubbornness. Dorn's absolute refusal to adapt his methods made him predictable and vulnerable to enemies who understood his patterns. His upbringing on Inwit taught him that survival depended on unwavering discipline, but Dorn applied this philosophy so rigidly that he couldn't adjust when circumstances demanded flexibility. He became incapable of changing tactics, even when his current approach was clearly failing. This inflexibility made Dorn's strategies predictable to intelligent enemies who could plan around his known responses. During post-heresy conflicts, Dorn's inability to adapt to new threats and changing battlefield conditions ultimately contributed to his mysterious disappearance, as his rigid methods proved inadequate against enemies who had learned to counter his tactics. This flaw of inflexible stubbornness turned Dorn's greatest strength, his unwavering resolve, into a predictable weakness that enemies could exploit. Konrad Curze's fatal flaw: nihilistic despair. Konrad Curze's visions of future darkness became a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroyed his moral foundation. His psychic ability to see potential futures showed him only violence, corruption, and failure, creating a nihilistic worldview that made positive outcomes seem impossible. Instead of fighting to prevent the dark futures he saw, Curze became convinced they were inevitable. This nihilistic despair made Curze increasingly brutal and erratic, as he reasoned that moral restraint was meaningless in a doomed universe. His methods became indistinguishable from those of the criminals he punished. By the time of the Horus Heresy, Curze welcomed his own assassination because it confirmed his vision of inevitable doom. This flaw of nihilistic despair transformed a champion of justice into the very monster he originally fought against, proving that losing hope makes darkness inevitable. Sanguinius's fatal flaw: sacrificial nobility. Sanguinius's need to personally bear every burden prevented him from making strategic sacrifices necessary for victory. His noble nature compelled him to shield others from danger, but this protective instinct made him predictable to enemies. Sanguinius consistently chose immediate heroic action over long-term strategic advantage. During the Siege of Terra, Sanguinius's nobility led him directly into Horus's trap aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Despite knowing that confronting Horus would likely result in his death, Sanguinius couldn't resist the opportunity to end the conflict through personal sacrifice. His predictable heroism gave Horus the chance to eliminate one of the Emperor's most powerful allies. This flaw of sacrificial nobility made Sanguinius's greatest virtue, his selfless heroism, into a tactical weakness that enemies could manipulate. Pharasmanes's fatal flaw: blind trust. Pharasmanes's inability to recognize corruption in those he loved made him vulnerable to betrayal by his closest allies. His friendship with Fulgrim was so deep that he couldn't accept evidence of his brother's fall to chaos. Pharas's trust was absolute and inflexible. Once given, it couldn't be withdrawn regardless of changing circumstances. At the Dropside Massacre, Pharas ignored tactical caution because he trusted Fulgrim's promise of single combat. When Fulgrim challenged him to personal combat, Pharas accepted immediately rather than considering the strategic implications or potential for deception. His inability to doubt those he loved made him incapable of protecting himself against their betrayal. This flaw of blind trust transformed Pharas's loyalty from a strength into a fatal vulnerability that cost him his life. Angron's fatal flaw: uncontrollable rage. The Butcher's nails destroyed Angron's capacity for rational leadership and strategic thinking. These Archaeotech implants amplified his aggression while gradually destroying his ability to experience any emotion other than rage. Angron became incapable of the careful planning necessary for effective command, reducing him to a weapon that could only be unleashed. This uncontrollable fury made Angron vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who could direct his anger towards specific targets. During the Horus Heresy, Chaos forces exploited his rage by offering him greater fury in exchange for his soul. Angron's inability to think beyond immediate violence made him incapable of recognizing long-term consequences, transforming him from a leader into a mindless avatar of bloodshed. This flaw of uncontrollable rage made Angron a prisoner of his own fury, ensuring he could never be more than a weapon pointed by others. Roboute Guilliman's fatal flaw: rigid planning. Guilliman's dependence on systematic organization made him vulnerable when facing chaotic, unpredictable enemies. His success on Makrage taught him that careful planning could solve any problem, but this methodology proved inadequate against foes who deliberately operated outside logical frameworks. Guilliman created the Codex Astartes as a comprehensive solution, but his adherence to systematic approaches made him inflexible when circumstances demanded improvisation. During the Horus Heresy, Guilliman struggled to respond effectively to traitor forces who used unpredictable tactics. His need to analyze and systematize every situation slowed his responses and made him vulnerable to enemies who acted on instinct rather than planning. This flaw of rigid planning meant that Guilliman's greatest strength, his organizational genius, became a weakness when facing enemies who thrived on chaos and disorder. Mortarion's fatal flaw: pride and resentment. Mortarion's pride in his own strength made him vulnerable to chaos corruption when his self-reliance proved insufficient. His upbringing on Barbarous taught him that survival depended on personal endurance and rejection of outside help, but this philosophy made him resentful when the Emperor intervened against the Xenos overlords. Mortarion's pride couldn't accept that he needed assistance. This pride and resentment made Mortarion susceptible to Nurgle's promises of independence during the Horus Heresy. When faced with threats beyond his ability to resist, Mortarion chose corruption over admitting weakness, believing that becoming a Daemon Prince was better than accepting help from the Emperor. This flaw of pride and resentment transformed Mortarion's self-reliance from a survival trait into the very weakness that damned his soul to chaos. Magnus the Red's fatal flaw: arrogant curiosity. Magnus's belief that his intellectual superiority justified ignoring restrictions led to catastrophic consequences. His psychic power and vast knowledge made him arrogant about his ability to handle dangerous situations that had destroyed lesser beings. When the Emperor warned him about sorcery dangers, Magnus assumed these restrictions didn't apply to someone of his abilities. This arrogance led Magnus to use forbidden sorcery to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal, despite explicit prohibitions. His belief that good intentions justify dangerous means resulted in the destruction of the Webway project and massive damage to the Emperor's plans for humanity. Magnus's inability to accept that some knowledge was too dangerous even for him led to his fall. This flaw of arrogant curiosity transformed Magnus's greatest asset, his thirst for knowledge, into the instrument of his own damnation. Horus Lupercal's fatal flaw: jealous ambition. Horus's need for constant validation and fear of being replaced made him vulnerable to chaos manipulation. As the Emperor's favorite son and chosen war master, Horus enjoyed unprecedented authority, but this position made him paranoid about losing his father's approval. When the Emperor returned to Terra for the Webway project, Horus interpreted this withdrawal as abandonment. This jealous ambition made Horus receptive to chaos, whispers about his true destiny, and the Emperor's supposed plans to discard him. His fear of becoming irrelevant overwhelmed his loyalty, leading him to rebel against the very father he desperately wanted to please. This flaw of jealous ambition transformed the Emperor's most trusted son into his greatest enemy, proving that even the most favored can fall when fear replaces faith. Lorgar Aurelian's fatal flaw: need for worship. Lorgar's desperate need to worship something greater than himself made him spiritually unstable when his faith was challenged. His religious upbringing created a psychological dependence on divine purpose that he couldn't abandon when the Emperor rejected worship. When his faith in the Emperor was shattered, Lorgar immediately began seeking new objects of veneration. This spiritual emptiness made Lorgar vulnerable to chaos, corruption, because the dark gods offered him the worship experience he craved. His need for divine purpose was so strong that he accepted even malevolent deities rather than living without spiritual meaning, making him the perfect vector for spreading chaos, corruption. This flaw of needing worship transformed Lorgar from the Emperor's most devoted son into the first herald of chaos, showing how spiritual dependency can become spiritual corruption. Vulcan's fatal flaw: excessive compassion. Vulcan's refusal to accept necessary sacrifices made him tactically ineffective in situations requiring hard choices. His compassion for all life prevented him from making decisions that could save more people in the long term, but required immediate suffering. While other Primarchs could calculate acceptable losses, Vulcan's emotional connection to individual lives made him incapable of strategic thinking when civilians were at risk. This excessive compassion made Vulcan predictable to enemies who could manipulate his protective instincts. By threatening innocent lives, hostile forces could control his tactical decisions and force him into disadvantageous positions. This flaw of excessive compassion meant that Vulcan's greatest virtue, his care for all life, became a tactical weakness that enemies could exploit to control his actions. Corvus Corax's fatal flaw: vengeful obsession. Corax's need for revenge after the Dropsite massacre consumed his judgment and led him to pursue increasingly dangerous courses of action. His desire to punish those responsible for his legion's near destruction became more important than rebuilding his forces or serving the Imperium's strategic needs. This obsession with vengeance made him reckless and willing to take risks that served emotional needs rather than tactical objectives. His pursuit of traitors into the warp demonstrates how his vengeful obsession ultimately corrupted him. Rather than accepting that some enemies were beyond reach, Corax chose to enter the realm of chaos itself in pursuit of revenge, making him vulnerable to the very corruption he sought to destroy. This flaw of vengeful obsession transformed Corax from a liberator fighting for justice into a creature consumed by hate, proving that the desire for revenge can corrupt even the most righteous. Alpharius and Omegon's fatal flaw: over-complexity. The Alpha Legion twins' obsession with elaborate deception made their strategies unnecessarily complicated and ultimately uncontrollable. Their belief that complex schemes were inherently superior to direct action led them to create plans so intricate that even they lost track of all variables involved. This overcomplexity made their operations vulnerable to unexpected developments. During the Horus Heresy, their true loyalties became so obscured by layers of deception that even they may have lost sight of their original objectives. Their schemes became self-perpetuating puzzles that served no clear purpose beyond demonstrating their cleverness, making them unreliable allies whose true contributions remain unknown. This flaw of overcomplexity transformed the Alpha Legion's greatest strength, their tactical flexibility, into their greatest weakness, as their plans became too convoluted to succeed. The Lost Primarch's fatal flaw: unknown but catastrophic. Whatever flaws the 2nd and 11th Primarchs possessed were so terrible that the Emperor chose to completely erase them from history rather than risk their influence spreading. Their fatal flaws remain the greatest mystery in Imperial history, but the fact that they required total eradication suggests they may have been the most dangerous of all. These unknown flaws were apparently so catastrophic that even remembering them posed a threat to the Imperium itself. Which Primarch's fatal flaw do you think was the most devastating to humanity? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this breakdown of the Primarch's greatest weaknesses, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40k deep dives.